Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about the colony of Virginia, the first English colony. So as I talked about at the end of the last video, you see growing English engagement and involvement with the Atlantic, but no successful colonies. This starts to change at the beginning of the 17th century. 1603, the Tudor dynasty finally ends and is replaced by the new Stuart dynasty under the leadership or under the rule of King James I of England. And so there's a new sense of optimism in England that's going to drive more successful colonization. But there are some other causes as well, so just want to highlight those quickly. Another cause, so we have a new dynasty, we have a growing English population, and we have increasingly limited opportunities in England. With a growing population, in the wealthier end of society, you have fewer opportunities for people who are surviving to adulthood or who aren't going to inherit significant estates. And then for the poorer classes, you also see a decline in opportunities. Previously, most landowners were arable farmers who would cultivate crops, and they would employ peasants or the poorer people in society to cultivate these crops, and then the peasants would keep some for themselves. That starts to change in the 17th century because these landowners start to switch over to farming animals rather than farming crops. And this requires far fewer laborers. And so the landlords start to fence off their lands. They start to remove the common land that people previously had raised the odd animal on or had cultivated crops for the landlord, and instead to use it only for their own animals. And so people at the poorer end of English society are struggling. And so they're willing to face the incredible risks and dangers, concerns that we often perhaps fail to recognize or underappreciate of making the crossing to the United States and working to make English colonies successful. Now, the structure of English colonies is going to be a little different from the Spanish colonies that we've talked about so far. Spanish colonies initially very tied to the monarchy. Everyone who goes is in some way sponsored by the monarchy. Oftentimes they are basically what today we would call employees of the monarchy. Someone like Cortez is doing what he's doing as a representative of Ferdinand and Isabel or Philip II. For the English, it's much more remote. The relationship between the colonists and the monarchy is much more distant. And in fact, the colonies are founded by companies as the actions of private companies. And this is the case in the example of the colony of Virginia. It is founded by a company called the Virginia Company, where different people take out stocks in the company. The company arranges to send colonists over to these lands to start establishing farms there, to start producing goods there. And then the idea is that the company receives the proceeds, or at least a percentage of the proceeds, from whatever the colonists raise and send back to England. And also the company sells goods to the colonists that the colonists need, and this makes money for the company as well. In practice, these are generally failing concerns for the companies. But what's interesting is that it establishes from the beginning that these companies are going to be significantly more independent of their government than the Spanish colonies were. That's an interesting distinction between Spanish and English colonies. And so the Virginia Company establishes the first English colony in the Americas that will survive. And it's a colony in Virginia that's known as the colony of Jamestown. So it's named after King James. And initially, life is very, very tough in this colony. It's in a river, in kind of a swampy area. There are all sorts of diseases that these people never had to deal with before. They came expecting to try and find gold like the Spanish did, but there was no gold, so they would have to farm. They weren't used to farming, and after about a year, it looks as though the colony is going to fail. The colony survives thanks to two men, John Smith, who's one of the original colonists, who's able to negotiate successfully with local Indian tribes who are another threat, who see the Virginia colonists as a threat. He's able to successfully work with them so that the Indians will supply them with food. And the other man is John Rolfe. John Rolfe pioneers the cultivation of tobacco in Virginia. And it's a new product, but they find that it's remarkably successful, that they can grow this crop successfully, and then they find that there's an emerging market for it in England. And even King James himself was kind of suspicious of this idea of smoking tobacco. But people want to be involved. It's kind of the trendy thing. And so the colony takes off and becomes financially successful, which means that more people want to make the dangerous passage and join the colony than they would have done otherwise. And so the cultivation of tobacco is what makes the Virginia colony successful. And so more and more people start to be willing to make the voyage to the New World and to join this colony. And there are a couple of other incentives for doing so. The first is the offer of land. Starting around 1620, anyone who buys a single share in the Virginia Company receives 50 acres of land if they can get over and take it. So the company is trying to encourage colonists to go to Virginia and take up this land because the idea is it's making money for the company. As long as the colonists are producing tobacco, sending it back to England, it's selling for good prices, the Virginia Company is doing really, really well and wants to keep encouraging colonization. The other benefit that the company offers is a form of representative government. The colonists can kind of govern themselves, and they can elect their own little council that will determine their own bylaws, subject to the overall laws of England. But again, who's going to enforce those when you're hundreds, thousands of miles away? And so again, we see this theme of greater independence and greater self-government in English colonies. You can probably see where this is headed. The other group of people, and this is one of the bigger groups of people that starts to come to the Virginia colony, are indentured servants. And so these are the very poor people in the English population that I talked about at the beginning of this video. The sort of people who are getting squeezed out by landlords enclosing their properties. People who don't have the money to pay for a voyage to the New World. But hearing about all the land, the unlimited land that's available in the New World, seeing the lack of opportunities at home, what they're willing to do is to offer their service to the Virginia Company in exchange for a passage to the New World. So basically they say, you give me a passage on ship to get to America, and in return, I will work for you for free for 7 years, however many years. And so you can imagine that their lives are very difficult. Assuming they survive the passage, they have to work for a number of years, very difficult conditions. They have some rights, they can sue the people that they're working for, but you can imagine it's very difficult for them to win a case. So they live very difficult lives, but again, there's that sense of opportunity. So these are the themes that are kind of emerging here: independence and opportunity. We see people who arrive in Virginia with nothing, who arrive as indentured servants with nothing, rise to become leaders of this colony within their own lifetime. That's the sort of social mobility that is inconceivable in the England that they're leaving. So settling these colonies requires hard work, but there are real, genuine opportunities for self-betterment. Along with the indentured servants, as we get into the second half of the 17th century, so Jamestown is founded in 1607. By 1700, about an eighth of the population are African slaves. And there are basically none by 1650. So this is a development that takes place in the second half of the 17th century. And the African slaves are treated the same way as the indentured servants. So again, it's not necessarily a racialized slavery. But unlike the indentured servants, they haven't chosen to be there, and their period of service never ends. So you can already see divisions emerging that are not emerging because of race, but will shape the development of a racialized slavery and a racially stratified society. In the meantime, in the second half of the 17th century, from 1650 to 1700, the division is more between different types of settlers. And we see this in Bacon's Rebellion. It's a great name for a rebellion. It takes place in 1676. Nathaniel Bacon was one of the poor settlers who are increasingly being driven further away from the coastland by wealthy settlers who take advantage of the fact that the colony is being successful. They're buying the best land, they're taking control of the best land, and the poorer settlers are having to go further away from the coast and start cultivating lands again. This brings the poorer settlers into conflict with Indian tribes, who had been told by the English settlers that no more land would be deforested to be used for agriculture, no more land would be taken from them. And so the wealthy English settlers and the governors who want to maintain a healthy trade with the Indians side with the Indians against the poorer English settlers and against the slaves. And so when this rebellion breaks out, it's poor English settlers and some African slaves against Native Americans and the wealthy English settlers. And in the end, the rebellion won't be successful, but it's a sign of the tension that's existing in the Virginia colony as we move forward. So the colony's been successful, but there are tensions within the colony about how the colony should continue to develop.